I said, I know, can you believe it? She pushes all of my buttons. And when he saw me interacting with her, he pulled me aside and he says, I've never seen you be such an asshole before.
Isn't that real emotion coming out of us?
I didn't like the idea of someone else owning my power. So you can't become more emotionally intelligent or improve your EQ very much just from reading a book.
This individual lacks some human skills, and he's always confronted with people, arguments to prove his point.
We're all carrying around this tool belt of emotions.
We react to it in a negative way, and then later on, we kind of regret.
And neither of us is willing to compromise on those foundational things.
I saw a piece that you wrote on your LinkedIn page, and that talks about an individual who was brushing his teeth while driving. Looking at it from emotional intelligence point perspective, what do you see in that? Can you elaborate on that scene that you experienced?
There's going to be like two avenues to explore when we talk about something like this, because one of it's going to be from the vantage point of me in the experience of seeing someone doing that. And so what goes on through emotional intelligence for me. And then also we could take a look at it from the perspective of the person in their car driving and brushing their teeth. So if we start with ourselves, anytime we witness a situation, generally we're all carrying around this tool belt of emotions, and we have sort of default emotions that we reach for in most situations. That's why they're default. We're patterned in our behaviors for how we respond when we see things. So when I that morning saw at 6:45 a.m. a gentleman driving out of our very urban neighborhood, probably on his way to work or somewhere that he needed to get to at a particular time, at least that's the assumption I'm making, brushing his teeth while driving, the first thing I thought about was, well, clearly he didn't give himself enough time. So I leapt from an emotional space of judgment into a judgment based on what I visually first saw. So exploring that for myself is like, why do I sit in the seat of an assumptive judgment the first time I see something like that? And it gives an opportunity to look inward in our emotional self-awareness and figure out what's beneath the iceberg of my own experiences that contributes to why I would do that, what contributes to how I would do that, how that was modeled for me as a kid, perhaps. And so it becomes sort of a pattern or a default in my experience.
So would that default be different from a person to person?
It sure would be. Sometimes it's really quite relatable. And at the same time, yes, can be very different, both from what we feel when we witness something like that and what we think about when we witness it.
You mentioned there's two aspects. One is the way you judge towards that incident. And you mentioned the other part is from the other person's point of view.
That is correct. Yeah. Having curiosity to be able to explore what could be going on in their world, that this is the experience that they're having. And this broadens our perspective. So when we look from someone else's experience, we can start to say like, maybe they actually prefer to brush their teeth while they're driving in the car than to do it in front of a sink. It seems like an obscene thing to have a preference around, but that could be a possibility, right? It could be that they were rushed this morning, had a really difficult late night. Maybe they have kids at home. Like, we just start to explore different contributors that could lead to what we see that have nothing to do with judgment, but actually encourages us to be a bit more empathetic to the experiences that people are having rather than judgmental, like, I clearly have a more superior morning routine than they do, or manage my time better than they do. And when we think about utilizing our emotional intelligence, yes, it's for our personal competency and skill set, but it's also a big deal when we think about our social interactions and our social competencies.
We have a saying in my culture where I came from, try to make 7 excuses before you judge a person. Put yourself in that person's shoes. I think there was a story, I can't remember where I read it from. There was an individual with 3 kids on a subway, and the kids were jumping around. People were judging, how come this man is not taking care of his children? Jumping around, disturbing, shouting and screaming, fighting. And then when he was asked, why aren't you taking care of your children? He said, their mother just passed away at the hospital. And then everyone was very empathetic towards the person, and
Mhm.
everyone was very helpful. That's quite fascinating.
It is really fascinating. Miguel Ruiz, The Four Agreements. Have you read or been introduced to his work
No.
at all? The his one of his four agreements is to be impeccable with your word, and the
Mm.
underpinning of that is, do I come from a space of a generous assumption or a lack of judgment? And it's a challenging, I think, thing for all of us to consider. How do I operate in my life in that way, and what would be the advantages of doing so? So when we consider an opportunity of like living egoically free, or being very mindful of how our ego can operate, taking that approach in life as a principle could be one that helps us to simply have a hyper stance in managing our ego and the impact our ego can have on ourselves and on other people. And yeah, so it's kind of a really interesting take on how many stories we probably can recount in life, just like this gentleman on a train, and all of the assumptions and judgments being made as to why his children are behaving in the way that they do. It's very relatable for us to think about how often we actually do that day in and day out, how many things we just default to judging in a very negative way, as opposed to judging through the lens of optimism or generosity or gratitude.
Mm. Why do we always naturally judge in a negative way?
Yeah, the power of evolution. So we think about how our brain, here comes the scientific part, everybody. When we think
Right.
about how our brain operates
Mhm.
from an evolutionary standpoint, information is synthesized or processed through our amygdala, our threat detection center, and it's looking for perceived threat. Now, when we lived in the cave, the perceived threat was the saber-toothed tiger. Like, we take a look out the cave, is there a tiger? No, okay, it's safe to proceed. Now we're not worried about tigers jumping out, right? So our what we perceive as threats is really anything and everything can be perceived as a threat. And so through our evolutionary process, we're not really just perceiving threatful things as life or death. I could perceive my boss walking towards me as a threat. I could perceive a gentleman's children disruptive on a train as a threat to me. And so my response mechanism is to treat it from a threat standpoint or a negativity bias. I'm looking for what's wrong. I'm looking for where
So
the gap
is
is.
that a good thing? Is that something?
No, not anymore.
Mhm.
We don't really need to look at as much as we're looking at through that lens. And this is the value of our emotional intelligence, is it teaches us to pay attention to the subtle signals of that's what's happening in how I'm processing information, and allow the information to pass through our threat detection system. I mean, like,
Mhm.
no, this isn't a threat. Pass through our emotion centers and understand what emotion information is involved in this, and then get up to our executive functioning, get through to our prefrontal cortex, where we can be rational and logical in our thinking process.
Initially, this conversation was supposed to be between you and Omar Aziz, and
Yes.
I'm so sorry to hear that Omar has passed away. Can you highlight a couple things that you both would have talked about so that we can celebrate Omar's legacy?
We can. I'm going to actually make some assumptions and leaps as to what we would have spoken about, because he passed 2 days before we had time for coffee to actually sit down and
Oh,
prepare ourselves.
so sorry.
So what I do know about him, and really appreciate it, as that's why I wanted to have the conversation with him, is his focus is engineering peak performance, and he does that through flow mechanisms and designing protocols, meaning habits that we implement daily that really encourages us to land in our state of flow. There's great synergy between his protocols and flow dynamics and emotional intelligence. In fact, we could have even argued that EI is foundational to his flow mechanics and protocols,
Wow.
meaning we need to have skills in self actualization, how we pursue what's meaningful to us. But how do we know what's meaningful to us? Is we have to determine the things that actually spark meaning. And that's an emotional experience. It's not an intellectual experience. And so sometimes in our conversations, we would be able to land exactly on the same page when we're talking about habits and practices that really contribute to optimum performance. And sometimes, not that we'd never be in conflict, but
Mhm.
sometimes we would have disagreements as to how to approach it, or
Mhm.
just alternate views on how to approach it. No one right or wrong. simply a different way of going after the same thing.
When there's a bit of friction
Mhm.
or disagreement in conversations, that kicks in our creativity level, done in a very civilized manner, of course. Right.
That's the primary difference between disagreeing and conflict, right?
Oh,
Conflict has the emotional undertones and relational undertones of a gap. And
okay,
so that's why we're in conflict.
so there's difference between disagreement and conflict.
Yes, very much
Okay.
so.
So what is the difference?
Okay. So disagreement is pretty neutral when we think about
Mm,
what is a disagreement. It's a neutral based experience in which we can resolve it with conversation
okay.
and compromise.
Uh-huh. And conflict?
Conflict is underpinning our inability to work together or arrive at a solution is more emotional and interpersonal relationship struggles and tension. So I might not like you, and that brings us toward conflict. We might have a different value system that we're both trying to defend, and that puts us in conflict with each other. We might have different purpose, vision, drivers, motivators, and that
Mm.
puts us in conflict with each other. And neither of us is willing to compromise on those foundational things. And so we're in conflict.
How would that having emotional intelligence,
Yes.
higher emotional intelligence level between people who are having conflict, will that conversation change into disagreement? Is there a possibility or
Yes,
mm,
and it usually requires one person in the conversation to have a high level of proficiency in emotional intelligence because the individual with higher EI will be able to help
what is EI? Sorry.
emotional intelligence is EI, EQ,
What is
emotion
EQ then?
quotient. Yeah, emotion
Okay.
quotient. So we could use them interchangeably. Emotional intelligence is the umbrella. It's talking about the theory, the content, the context of emotional intelligence, all of the skills, the realms, sub skills, like all of that.
Okay.
Whereas emotion quotient, just like IQ,
IQ.
intellectual quotient, is the measurement of one's emotional intelligence.
Uh-huh.
So we can measure your proficiency across a variety of skills in emotional intelligence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So how can we measure EQ?
So EQ is measured through a series of questions or statements, statements that are behavior based. So when we think about a skill is a representation of a number of times we repeat a behavior. And the more I repeat a certain behavior, the more proficient I am in that skill.
Okay.
Seemingly,
Mm,
the less I repeat that behavior, the less proficient I am in that skill.
correct.
So when we're measuring EQ, self assessments, I'm only measuring my EQ based on what I think, is going to be somewhat subjective. But in the EQI model, that's the assessment that I use. There's validity and reliability markers in it to ensure that the individual isn't overly positively assessing their skill set or overly negatively assessing their skill set. And when we have a 360 view, we're inviting raters to also assess our emotional intelligence. So people that we know, whether it's our manager, our peers, our direct reports, our friends and family, they're going to contribute based on what they see us do on the same statements related to behaviors.
Mhm.
And that measures our proficiency. So if we want to turn up or improve a skill set,
Mhm.
then we can look specifically at repeating the behaviors of that skill.
So who determines the measuring mechanism that we use for EQ?
All of the scientists
Okay.
that did the research work to
Okay.
determine
Is it
that
standardized?
well, the EQI is a standardized test, but
Mm.
there are a few emotional intelligence or emotion quotient assessments out there. None are as reliable or valid as the EQI. That's why I chose that one to practice.
EQI?
EQI 2.0. Reuven
Oh,
Bar-On is the creator of this assessment.
okay, so there is EI,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
there's EQ,
Mm-hmm.
and now you're mentioning you're adding one more extra to this, and I don't know. I'm going on. Okay, so
EI is emotional intelligence.
correct, yeah,
EQ is
is
emotion
the
quotient. That's the
quotient.
measurement of your
Okay,
emotional intelligence.
uh-huh.
EQI is the tool to measure your emotion quotient.
I know an individual who is really expert in a lot of things like
Mm-hmm.
scientific models, and
Mm-hmm.
he's got very high IQ level, and he always brags about it. And whenever we have a conversation, he talks about how his IQ is 135. I believe that's what he says all the time. This individual lacks some human skills,
Hmm.
and he's always confronting with people. He's always having arguments to prove his point. And he tried to start several businesses and they all failed. He does not get along with nobody. What is happening with this individual? Does that mean his EQ level is like zero or?
Some EQ skills will be low in proficiency, and improving them is actually a lot easier than most people would think, because emotional intelligence practices are not complicated in their design. They're actually quite simple in their design. They're hard to use because we're resisting something that's going on within ourselves that's a more comfortable state.
Is it ego?
It might be a bit of ego. Like,
Mm.
I would look immediately towards the self-perception realm, but then we'd have to dig quite deeply in conversation to figure out what's contributing to that. So when we think about you and I and everybody we know went to school, and then we consider from what age did we start in a system that stack ranked us against each other based on how smart we are and rewarded us as such. So now I become an adult whose whole life, perhaps like this gentleman, I was only rewarded based on how smart I was. So now I have a strong connection of my value to my IQ. And if anyone questions that, that makes me question my value. It's important when we think about where someone might be struggling with their EI to consider there's a history of life experiences that are likely contributing to why they're showing up the way that they're showing up. And if we could heal, because that's generally what needs to happen, the value connection of I'm only worthy when I'm smart, if we can heal that and help them to find their worthiness outside of their IQ, then there'll be willingness to practice the strategies that are social intelligence strategies that help them to actually engage with other people. Because to your point, no one wants to hang out with the asshole. No one's going to stick around to find out how smart you
Yeah.
are if they don't like hanging out with you.
Yeah, and especially when they're bragging about it.
Yeah.
So, for a person to heal
Mm-hmm.
from this issue that they're having,
Mm-hmm.
don't they have to accept first?
Mm-hmm.
So, isn't like that acceptance is very difficult for a lot of people, or
Yeah.
the acknowledgement is difficult. The acknowledgement, I think, comes first before seeking help, right? Is that correct?
A willingness
Hmm.
to explore it is a necessary piece of the puzzle. Yeah. Which means
So,
a willingness to sit down and entertain it.
hmm,
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult for a person to willingly, accept like,
It can be.
yeah.
I would agree. It can be. And then for a lot of people, sometimes what I'm recognizing is they hit the point,
Mm.
they reach a point when they finally go, maybe it's time for me to take a look at that. I've heard it enough times now. I think I'm ready to actually take a look at what that means.
So I've seen this consistency where people seek for a purpose, especially for men between age group 35 to 40s.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this come over and over again with a lot of conversations I've had. For women, I think, I don't know, early 30s.
Generally, when we gender bias,
Mhm.
male and female, we're going to find that there is sort of an age gap that does exist. And yes, women typically a bit sooner in age when in their exploration and
Mm.
deciding purpose-driven balance, well-being, as opposed to men a bit later. And I think often we can probably contribute that towards again, if we look historically back in male and female experiences, we could probably contribute that back to women tend to enter into community and conversations of vulnerability a lot sooner in their life with the people in their life, compared to how early men will do that, and the vulnerability of being able to speak about things like that. And that probably is what encourages women to move through that a lot faster than men.
I want to know more about EQ. You mentioned this is a skill that we
Yes.
can learn.
Yes.
And once we learn, is that sufficient? Is that good enough? Hey, can I say, I can apply this in my daily life?
So you can't become more emotionally intelligent or improve your EQ very much just from reading a book.
Okay.
So I can learn about EI until I actively apply it day to day. my EQ won't shift.
So how do a person apply?
This is,
Give me an
I know
example.
this, I'm going to give you a short answer and then
Yeah.
I'll expand on it.
Okay.
They have to do it. So, like
They have to
any
do it.
skill, emotional intelligence, emotional quotient is no different than any skill you want to get better at.
Mm,
So, if I wanted to be better at dribbling a basketball, I have to dribble a basketball regularly. And
correct.
if I want to have greater emotional intelligence, I have to actively be using, like intentionally
Mm,
using my emotional intelligence day in and day out. Now, you said skill. Just going to add a little correction of skills, plural, either
skills.
with an S or a
Okay.
Z, depending upon your style. Because in the EQI model, there are 15 skills when we're talking about emotional intelligence.
Mm,
So if I wanted you to work on the foundational skills of emotional self-awareness and impulse control, then I would give you specific exercises that you would be doing daily to actively apply your emotional intelligence. And a lot of those exercises, I'd have you document them on pen and paper until they become such a natural part of what you do, you don't need pen and paper anymore. They're integrated into how you naturally think
habit.
and operate. That's right. Yeah.
Mm. Can you give me an example, like one example of something that I can better myself in my EQ skill?
Yes, for sure. So,
Yeah.
impulse control is probably one of the most common exercises most people have to include in their foundational work because we are default reacting to things.
Yes.
So, impulse control is creating space
Yeah.
between whatever is triggering me, the stimulus, and my response to it.
Is
Because
it
without
control or management? Impulse.
impulse control,
Control. Okay.
yes.
Okay.
So, right now, when people start their work, there's a short amount of time between stimulus trigger and their reaction. That's why it's a reaction. And what we're trying to do with impulse control is create space so they can have a response. And space is just about waiting, it's time. That's all I need. And
Okay.
so, an active practice for impulse control is every single time before you say something, you have to count to 3. And if I practice that all the time, not just when I'm experiencing a negative emotional reaction, which causes me to blurt something out that I end up sticking my foot in my mouth about, if I practice it all the time, then I learn how to be less impulsive and more regulatory of my emotions. Even
Wow.
if I don't understand them yet,
Yeah.
I'm simply going to get better at regulating because I've learned how to pause and create some space.
So that pause is counting 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm. It's
Is that
simple, right? This
it's
is
it's
not a
it's
I'm
very simple, yeah.
it's not a complicated principle, but
Mm.
when we think about the simplicity of putting it into action, just think about how many things trigger you to automatic reactions.
So what happens at that moment while counting the 3? Like,
Well,
yeah.
one, I
Mm.
have to pull my attention away from my reaction
Okay.
in order to count. If instead of counting, I actually focus on 3 breaths, then I have to bring my focus to my body rather than my brain. My brain wants to do something reactionary
Yes.
because that's what reactions are. They are fast patterns between trigger and what happens after that. And if I breathe and pull my attention to my body, then my brain has to interrupt that fast pattern cycle. And as soon as I interrupt it, it starts to get weaker. And if I learn how to do something else
Mm.
because of my impulse control, then I create a better response pattern. I give myself an opportunity in impulse control to insert other emotional intelligence skills that help me to become actually more emotionally intelligent in my response.
So this is something that we could even practice with our children when they push the buttons and we react to it in a negative way. And then later on, we kind of regret, what did I do? What did I say? We all experience that as parents. And
Yeah.
so if we count 1, 2, 3, is that good enough?
No, it's a starting
It's a
point. It's
starting
never
point.
going to be good enough.
Mhm.
For some people, it already makes a drastic difference. I have a
Mm.
client right now that I'm working with, and that was her first strategy, is just to give herself a little bit of time. She was focused while we are doing professional coaching. She had recognized her trigger response or reaction was much worse at home with her kids than it is at work. And of course, we talk about the difference between personal and professional. The risk is higher in the professional environment of an outburst. You can get fired.
Yeah.
But at home, well, your
Yeah.
kids aren't going to fire you. They might not like you,
Yeah.
but they're not going to fire you. But another negative ripple impact of her reaction is that she internalized it to being a bad mom. And so, twofold, the impulse control was giving her more control over her response with her children, which made her turn to better parenting responses, which got better responses out of her children. But two, she stopped internalizing that she's a bad mom because she stopped doing bad mom behaviors.
Wow.
It was legit that she was
That's
saying to
fascinating.
herself, I'm being a bad mom. I'm like, there's truth in that. It's
Yeah.
because you're outburst reacting to your children when you know wisdom
Uh-huh.
tells you there's better. And so once she gave herself a shot to do better, she could start integrating, I'm actually a good mom when I give myself a chance to be a good mom. And impulse control is just about giving yourself a
Yeah.
chance to do something better, more emotionally intelligent.
Wow. Something as simple as counting one, two, three
Mm-hmm.
could have a drastic change.
Mm-hmm. There's Shirzad Shamin.
Mm.
His research and work is around positive intelligence. He calls it a PQ rep because his impulse control practice is to rub your thumb and your fingertip together in the immediacy of noticing an emotional reaction. And I think we can all relate to when I say emotional reaction, we're automatically going to think about something quote unquote bad, a bad emotional reaction. I'm
Mm.
triggered negatively. I don't believe emotions are good or bad. They're just information
Mhm.
for the purposes of helping the collective community understand what I mean when I say emotional reaction. I'm talking about ones that are unpleasant,
Yeah.
usually high in energy, angry,
Yeah.
frustrated, annoyed, or about to react. If in that moment that we notice the signal in our body, our cheeks flush, we get a lump in our throat, our stomach gets a knot in it, tension in our shoulders, we get a lot of physical cues of our emotions. If I put my fingertip and my thumb together and I simply rub them together and focus on what the ridges of my fingerprint feel like, you can't stay in the same emotional energy. It automatically pulls you to a different emotional energy because when you focus on your body, your breathing changes. And your breathing is connected to your vagus nerve, which is heart rate and blood pressure. As soon as you start to breathe in a way that lowers those two things, your emotional energy changes. And it usually becomes more calm and more regulated. And it's a very simple practice of just rubbing and you could do that and no one would even notice that that's what you're doing.
Okay. That's
Unless, of
pretty.
course, you hold them up in front of your face when someone's talking.
Here. That
That
would
would
be
be
cool.
hysterical. What are you doing? I'm doing some
I'm
PQ reps. I'm trying to regulate myself.
So, wow. Okay. So basically, it's a way for us to process, and we're just giving ourselves that moment.
We
And
might not actually even be processing yet.
yeah.
We haven't even applied reality testing and objectivity.
Okay.
We're just calming ourselves down. We're regulating. Because when our emotions go from wellness
Mhm.
to pebble to brick to boulder, we are less likely as we extend out into boulder to be able to regulate that emotion. Impulse control and a PQ rep or breathing 3 times regulates the physical nature of an emotion, which means it's going to bring us back into maybe pebble. It
Okay.
might not bring us all the way to wellness, but it could bring us to a pebble state of emotions. And it is much easier for us to access our IQ in a pebble state emotion
Mhm.
than a boulder state emotion.
I have a scenario. Back where I came from, we had these kids. We called them ELSO, which really means kids off the streets. Sometimes they're begging, they're selling a few things.
Mhm.
They are really persuasive. Is there any correlation about EQ with these children that are, growing up in the streets? And I feel like maybe they have higher EQ level. What do you say about that?
They might have higher EQ, especially within the social competencies of
Uh-huh.
EQ, and they might also know how to use it as manipulation. Because, like any skill or tool, it can be used for evil.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so,
Yeah.
development of emotional intelligence can certainly be used for manipulation or coercion. They might actually have learned through their street smart. Um, RICE is an acronym for four motivators that we can tap into socially to influence behavior. So R is rewards. So if I understand what rewards drive you, I could influence your behavior and get you to do something. Ideology is the I. So if I understand your ideology, like what drives you from a value standpoint, then I could manipulate that to get you to do something I want you to do.
Mhm.
C is just straight up coercion. So I can be coercive in the way that I approach and motivate someone. Generally, that works well on people who are quite vulnerable and insecure. And then E is ego. If I know how to play to your ego, I can manipulate your behavior as well. Now, when we think from a standpoint of malice, the kids on the street, are
Mhm.
they coming from a position of malice in their manipulation, or are they coming from a position of, if I sell this, I get food to put on the table? And I'm not really hurting anybody when
Mhm.
I sell this. So, like, that's not where we need to perhaps justify the
Yeah.
behavior that they're doing, but we can identify they're probably using some good EI skills.
EI is something that needs to be practiced over and over again into your life in order for you to become better with your emotional intelligence.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, we want to take a look at it from a space of nurture and nature. So, a lot of times, without even learning what emotional intelligence is and being assessed, you could have high proficiency across a number of skills in EI, and you had no idea that's what you were actually doing because you weren't labeling it that way. But you grew up in environments that encourage these actual skills, or you have qualities, traits, characteristics, personality that actually is these skills. They just come naturally to you. Other ones do not. And so we would have to nurture those skills through habits and practices.
For example,
Some people are quite unbalanced in empathy and assertiveness, especially empaths. So, a personality trait is being an empath, someone who's very sensitive to the emotions of others, can pick up on it quite easily. We might know people in our life that are like that. They're incredibly sensitive and intuitive around what other people are experiencing, and they have deep feelers for other people's emotional experiences. But those people are also usually heavily unbalanced with assertiveness. So, what ends up happening in their expression of empathy is they feel what other people are feeling. In leadership, that might mean they dismiss expectations because someone is having a bad day, as opposed to if that leader were to dial up their assertiveness, they could understand with empathy someone's experience and hold them accountable to an expectation at the same time rather than compromising one or the other.
so with IQ, sometimes I think we can argue saying this person got higher IQ because of in this person's DNA. Is there any relation to genetics with EQ?
So one of the primary differences in the research is that EQ is learnable at
Mhm.
any age, and we don't have an aptitude cap, meaning IQ development, my aptitude for learning math and spatial awareness, all these things we measure in IQ, caps at about age 19. So I won't be smarter at math the more I study math. My aptitude for it ends by the time I'm 19. EQ doesn't have an age gap. So I can learn and develop my skills as much as I want at any time as long as I keep practicing them. So it's very much a growth mindset attitude when it comes to EQ. So whether we're born with it or not is a different thing, because I am born wired a certain way for different personality traits. And as those personality traits are formulated through age 5 and 7 is when they cap, I might naturally possess certain EQ skills quite early in life. And if they're fostered, encouraged, then I will get much better at them. So if I'm a young kid who is encouraged to be empathetic towards others, to sit and listen in curiosity, to care about someone's experience, then I will naturally develop a quite high level of proficiency around the skill of empathy. If I learn also to then remain separate from someone else's emotional experience, not get sucked into it, and remain objective, stay independent of someone's emotional experience while I'm also being empathetic, then I will also learn to have a high level of independence in my emotional
Oh.
intelligence. If I also then learn in that same space of conflict or disagreement to adapt, to shift my thoughts and my ideas, to actually expand my thinking when someone presents a new perspective, then I will develop the skill of flexibility and emotional intelligence. So from a young age, things will be modeled for me, nurtured and encouraged just as much as they could be not modeled, turned off, or discouraged. So I could naturally have an aptitude towards assertiveness, and someone tells me You're too loud, stay quiet. And that could squash my assertiveness skill from a young age because it's not encouraged. Silence is encouraged.
Wow.
So culturally, familially, even with my friends, any environment I might be in from a young age could be a helper or a hindrance to my natural EQ development.
So parents have to do quite a bit of heavy lifting.
They sure do. My personal belief is like, yes, they need to do some heavy lifting. Pay attention to the kid, nurture what you see as strengths, provide some skill development for what you see as weaknesses.
So parents have a bit of learning to do before they even apply, because if you don't have something to give, how are you going to give, right?
That's right.
Is there any material that you provide to parenting?
Emotional
I know
intelligence for parenting?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where personal competencies before social competencies comes into play. So I believe everyone's responsibility is work on your personal competencies and your emotional intelligence, and then you'll be better able to work on the social competency skills, the ones you use when you're with other people.
When did you get into this emotional intelligence? Take us a little back in your journey.
I have my specific genesis moment. I was 26 years old and I was at a family function. My sister's boyfriend was invited. This is the first time he was around our family as a whole. However, I had known him for about a year because he was a member at the gym that I worked at.
Okay.
That's how my sister and he were introduced. So he had seen me socially for a year before seeing me around the entirety of my family, specifically before seeing me around my mom. So my trigger person was my mom at that time. And when he saw me interacting with her, he pulled me aside and he says, "What's wrong with you?" He asked me that question. And I said, "What do you mean what's wrong with me?" He's like, I've never seen you be such an asshole before.
Oh my God.
And I knew exactly what he was talking about because this was not the first time that I heard this either. I'd gotten this feedback from other family members and other friends when they see me interacting with my mom. And I said, "I know, can you believe it? She pushes all of my buttons. I can't believe she does." And I just went on the same old familiar rant that I went on, blaming my mother for all of my behaviors toward her. And because it wasn't the first time someone gave me the feedback, it also wasn't the first time I gave that as my response to it. I had a moment of clarity where I went, that sounds a lot like bullshit, like to myself. And I went home that night really thinking about it, thinking about that just might not be it. That's not good enough anymore. There's something there. So when I got up the next morning, I went to the bookstore. Because someone must have figured this out already and probably wrote about it.
Yeah.
And this is
I'm not alone.
1998. Like
Wow.
bookstores and the number of books out in the self-help section do not look like they do today. But when I went to the bookstore, I was looking at the shelf, and you know how they have binding out, face out, binding out, face out.
Did you know what you were looking for?
I did not. I did not know what I was looking for. I just thought it'll hit me in the title. I think it was just like hopeful, wishful thinking. And this one book, Face Out, Mama Drama, for the one woman that pushes all of your buttons, Susan McGregor. And I thought, well, that looks about right. And it almost even seemed like the light from the bookstore was shining a spotlight on it. Like, this is for you. So I pulled it off the shelf and I started reading it. Like I do with most books before I buy them, is I read a little bit to make sure I like the style and the content is really good. And I came across two things very early on in this book. One was Susan McGregor says, "No one makes you feel anything, you choose." And that blew my mind. Just reading the statement, I went, what? And the second was, every time you let someone determine how you're going to react, you lose all of your power. And that second one hit me even harder than the first one.
Fascinating.
Because I didn't like the idea of someone else owning my power. But all of it was in my control because I was allowing all of it to happen. And that was the beginning of exploring emotional self-awareness.
Wow.
She didn't call it EI.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what I was working on, is my impulse control.
It's empowering.
Yes.
Telling you don't allow someone else control your behaviors.
Yeah. Because what's the first thing we do when we don't like what someone is doing? Yeah. And we try to get them to change.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And yet our emotional intelligence is all about
blocks right away.
Change you.
Yeah.
Change you. Change your response to them and see what happens. And sure enough, I changed my response and a lot happened, which resulted in then finding Travis Bradberry and Gene Greaves' book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And one of his exercises in there, Watch Yourself Like a Hawk, involved taking a little notebook and a golf pencil, carry it around with you everywhere, and simply capture every time you have an emotional reaction and jot down what triggered it, what you felt, and what you thought about, and then how you responded. What was your typical reaction?
The typical reaction when we're triggered, it's negative for most of the time,
That's right.
correct?
Yeah.
Isn't that real emotion coming out of us? Why should I rephrase it in a way where it doesn't upset the other person? This is like anger coming from me. Why do I need to control my anger? Shouldn't I just show my anger?
Right. Well, we can show it when we understand it, because then we can articulate and communicate it. Generally, we're not articulating and communicating our anger when we're reacting to it. And also, what makes our emotion, our initial emotion, valid and accurate? If it's a reaction and not a response, maybe it's not actually valid or accurate, especially if it's my ego.
Okay, so it's the reaction that we just throw at.
It doesn't mean that I can't be angry or that I have to oppress my anger. It means I have to understand my anger so then I can communicate my anger.
We're not supposed to be controlling. We are managing our emotions. Is that correct? Like,
yeah, there are different words, and language is powerful, right?
Yeah.
So oftentimes in emotional intelligence, we're using the word regulating.
Regulating. Okay.
Yes, because our emotions have energy to them and pleasantness. That's sort of the axes of our emotions, energy and pleasantness.
Okay.
And every time we experience an emotion, it's important for us to sort of check before we wreck. So here's my trigger. Here's the thing that is setting me off. Let me just check. Is this an appropriate and a valid response or reaction, an emotional experience to this thing that's going on? Sometimes we just give ourselves free rein to feel what we want to feel about anything and just accept that that's the way we're feeling about it. But it's much more intellectual, emotionally intelligent to pause and just say, is this even valid or accurate?
How do we wrap this? What would be your final words for our audiences watching this podcast? What would be the one takeaway?
Well, we did cover quite a bit of ground, didn't we?
Yes.
And I think this question for me sounds it's a prescriptive type question, and it's something I try to stay away from, is prescribing something for people to do, because you did earlier ask me, where would people start? And I'm like, impulse control is a foundational skill set. Just give ourselves a shot at something different. And then I would also say anything you heard today that resonated with you is an opportunity to act on it in a way that feels very authentic. Because we all have different sort of risk tolerance levels to doing something different and challenging ourselves. Right now we have this phrase in Canada about elbows up. And that is the same. When I'm trying to stretch my comfort zone and grow and evolve and do something different, everyone has a different level of comfort with their elbows up. And so start with low-lying fruit. If you heard something you think, I'd like to try that in this moment, then start trying it in that moment. Run the experiment. See how it goes. See how it works for you, and keep tweaking the dials as you notice, this is better. I feel better. It gets a better result. It's incremental steps in our emotional intelligence development of patterns that we repeat over and over again, and we continue to fine tune or polish.
EQ 1.0?
Any point you would like to call it. Yeah. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.